Sarah Martinez had always been the black sheep of the wealthy Martinez family. While her siblings pursued traditional careers in law and business, she chose a path that horrified her conservative parents. At 18, she enlisted in the Navy, determined to prove herself in a world dominated by men. Her family's reaction was swift and brutal. Her father, a prominent real estate mogul, cut off all financial support. Her mother refused to speak her name at family gatherings. Her siblings were instructed to treat her as if she no longer existed. The rejection stung, but Sarah channeled her pain into determination. Basic training was grueling, but she excelled. Her instructors noticed her exceptional physical fitness, mental toughness, and unwavering focus. When the opportunity came to try out for the Navy SEALs, Sarah knew this was her calling. The selection process was brutal. Of the 200 candidates who started, only 12 would make it through. Sarah was the only woman. The training pushed her beyond every limit she thought she had. She carried 200-pound logs through freezing surf, endured sleep deprivation that made her hallucinate, and faced instructors who seemed determined to break her spirit. Many nights, she lay in her bunk thinking about her family's comfortable mansion, wondering if she was foolish to choose this hellish path. But every morning, she got up and pushed forward. Her fellow trainees initially viewed her with skepticism. Some made crude jokes about her presence. Others simply ignored her, convinced she would quit within days. But as weeks turned into months, Sarah's persistence began earning respect. She never complained, never asked for special treatment, and often helped struggling teammates even when she was exhausted herself. The final phase of training took place in a simulated combat environment. Candidates were dropped in hostile territory with minimal supplies and had to complete a series of missions while evading capture. Sarah's team was ambushed during their second night. 2 teammates were injured, and they were surrounded by instructors playing enemy forces. While others panicked, Sarah took command. She created a diversion, allowing her team to escape, then used her knowledge of the terrain to guide them to safety. Her commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, watched from a distance as Sarah carried a wounded teammate for 3 miles through rough terrain. He had served for 25 years and rarely saw such dedication. That night, he made a note in her file that would change her military career forever. When graduation day arrived, Sarah stood among the 11 other survivors. Her family was nowhere to be seen. The empty seats where her parents should have sat felt like a physical weight on her chest. But as she received her SEAL pin, she felt something she had never experienced before: complete confidence in who she was. The local newspaper ran a small story about the first woman to complete SEAL training from their city. Her parents read it over breakfast without comment. Her father folded the paper and announced they were selling their beach house. Her mother suggested they take a vacation to Europe, somewhere far from any reminders of their daughter's choices. Sarah's first assignment took her to a classified location overseas. She excelled in reconnaissance missions, her small frame allowing her to access areas larger teammates couldn't reach. Her ability to remain calm under pressure made her a valuable asset during hostage rescue operations. Fellow SEALs who had initially doubted her began requesting her for their teams. During a particularly dangerous mission in hostile territory, Sarah's unit was tasked with extracting a captured diplomat. Intelligence suggested the target was being held in a heavily fortified compound. The mission required someone to infiltrate the building and disable security systems from the inside. Sarah volunteered without hesitation. She spent 3 weeks preparing, studying blueprints, learning the guards' routines, and perfecting her cover identity. The night of the mission, she slipped through perimeter security undetected. Moving through the compound like a shadow, she systematically disabled cameras and alarms while her team waited for her signal. The extraction went flawlessly. The diplomat was rescued without a shot being fired, and valuable intelligence was recovered from the compound's computers. Sarah's commanding officers were impressed, but she felt a strange emptiness. All her life, she had craved her family's approval. Now she had achieved something extraordinary, and there was no one from her old life to share it with. Letters from home stopped coming entirely. Her childhood friends, influenced by her family's disapproval, gradually cut contact. Sarah threw herself deeper into her military career, accepting increasingly dangerous assignments. She told herself she didn't need anyone's approval, but late at night, the loneliness was overwhelming. Her reputation in the SEAL community grew. Other units requested her expertise for special operations. She became known for her ability to remain invisible, gathering intelligence in situations where larger teams would be detected. Her skills saved countless lives and prevented numerous terrorist attacks. Years passed in a blur of missions, training, and brief respites between deployments. Sarah climbed the ranks, earning respect from superiors and peers alike. She had found her tribe among her fellow warriors, people who understood sacrifice and commitment. But the wound left by her family's rejection never fully healed. On her 30th birthday, Sarah sat alone in a military base dining hall, eating cake with teammates who had become her chosen family. One of them raised a toast to her latest commendation for bravery. As she smiled and accepted their congratulations, she wondered if her real family even remembered this day. She had no way of knowing that her parents had moved across the country, deliberately choosing a home far from any military installations. Her mother had boxed up all of Sarah's childhood belongings and donated them to charity, erasing every trace of her daughter's existence from their home. When asked by curious neighbors about their children, they spoke only of their lawyer's son and their banker daughter. Sarah had become a ghost to them, a person who had never existed. 10 years into her military career, Sarah had become a legend within special operations circles. Her code name, Ghost, was whispered with reverence among intelligence operatives worldwide. She could speak 5 languages fluently, had mastered advanced hand-to-hand combat techniques, and possessed an uncanny ability to blend into any environment. Her psychological profile noted an unusual capacity for compartmentalization, allowing her to function at peak performance regardless of personal stress. The mission that would change everything began on a rainy Tuesday morning in Virginia. Sarah was called into a briefing room where 3-star General Patricia Wilson waited with classified files spread across a metal table. The general's expression was grim as she explained the situation. A terrorist organization had kidnapped 12 American aid workers from a refugee camp in East Africa. Intelligence suggested they were being held in multiple locations across a war-torn region controlled by various militant groups. What made this mission particularly dangerous was the political sensitivity. Any military action had to remain completely covert. If discovered, the United States would deny all involvement. Sarah would be operating without official backup, relying solely on local assets and her own skills. The general made it clear that failure was not an option, but success might never be publicly acknowledged. Sarah studied satellite images of the region for hours. The terrain was unforgiving, dense jungle punctuated by rebel-controlled towns and government checkpoints. The hostages were scattered across 3 different compounds, each heavily guarded and booby-trapped. A conventional rescue attempt would likely result in casualties among both the hostages and rescue team. She proposed an audacious plan. Rather than a direct assault, she would infiltrate each location separately, gathering intelligence and preparing the way for simultaneous extractions. It would require her to maintain multiple cover identities while navigating between hostile factions who were actively hunting for foreign operatives. The preparation took 3 months. Sarah learned to speak the local dialect fluently, studied regional customs, and underwent physical alterations to better blend in. She memorized the organizational structures of various militant groups and their internal conflicts. Most importantly, she established contact with underground networks of local civilians who opposed the terrorist organizations. Her first identity was as a freelance journalist documenting the refugee crisis. This allowed her access to areas near the first compound while gathering intelligence about guard rotations and security measures. She spent 2 weeks in a refugee camp, building relationships with displaced families who provided valuable information about militant movements in the region. The conditions in the camp were heartbreaking. Families who had lost everything struggled to survive in makeshift shelters. Children went to bed hungry every night while disease spread through overcrowded quarters. Sarah found herself deeply affected by their suffering, especially when she met Maria, a 7-year-old girl who had been separated from her parents during an attack on their village. Maria reminded Sarah of herself at that age, fierce independence masking deep vulnerability. The little girl had appointed herself protector of 3 younger children whose families had been killed. Despite having nothing, she shared her meager food rations and told stories to keep the others from crying at night. Sarah saw her own determination reflected in the child's eyes. Working with local contacts, Sarah confirmed the location of the first group of hostages. They were being held in a converted school building surrounded by armed guards. The terrorists had rigged the entrances with explosives, making any direct assault extremely dangerous. Sarah realized she needed to find another way inside. She spent days observing the compound from various vantage points, noting patterns in the guards' behavior. She discovered that food deliveries came from a local woman who had been coerced into cooperation through threats against her family. Sarah made contact with this woman, learning that she desperately wanted to help but was terrified of the consequences. Together, they devised a plan. Sarah would hide inside one of the large food containers, allowing the woman to smuggle her past the outer security. Once inside, she would assess the hostage's condition and plant tracking devices that would allow her backup team to monitor the situation remotely. The night of the infiltration, Sarah squeezed herself into a metal container typically used for rice deliveries. The space was cramped and airless, making the journey to the compound feel endless. She could hear guards talking just inches from her hiding spot, their weapons clicking as they inspected the delivery. Inside the compound, Sarah discovered that the 4 hostages were in worse condition than intelligence reports suggested. 2 were suffering from untreated injuries sustained during their capture, and all showed signs of malnutrition and psychological trauma. The guards were unpredictable and violent, making any rescue attempt extremely risky. She managed to make brief contact with Dr. James Fletcher, the leader of the aid group. In whispered conversation, he confirmed that the hostages had been moved several times and that some guards spoke of plans to sell them to another terrorist organization. Time was running out. Sarah planted her surveillance devices and prepared to leave, but a commotion outside changed everything. Government forces had launched an unrelated operation nearby, causing panic among the guards. In the chaos, she realized this might be her only chance to act. Moving silently through the building, she systematically neutralized 3 guards without raising any alarm. She then began preparing the hostages for emergency extraction, explaining in urgent whispers that they needed to trust her completely. Dr. Fletcher helped calm the others while Sarah established contact with her extraction team. The escape required perfect timing. Sarah had identified a weakness in the compound's rear perimeter where a drainage ditch provided concealment. She would lead the hostages through this route while her team created a diversion at the main entrance. Everything had to happen simultaneously, or they would all be captured or killed. As they prepared to move, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in a broken window. Dirt-covered and exhausted, she looked nothing like the privileged daughter who had once lived in a mansion. She thought briefly of her family, wondering if they would ever know about this moment. Then, she pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the mission. The extraction began at midnight. Sarah led the hostages through the drainage system while explosions echoed from the main compound. They crawled through mud and debris for what felt like hours, stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. Behind them, the building they had escaped from was now engulfed in flames. When they finally reached the extraction point, Sarah felt a moment of triumph. For lives had been saved, and she had gathered intelligence that would help locate the remaining hostages. But her celebration was short-lived. Radio chatter indicated that their escape had been discovered, and enemy forces were mobilizing throughout the region. The second compound would be even more heavily guarded now, and her cover identities might be compromised. Sarah realized she was now operating in a situation where capture meant certain death, not just for her, but potentially for all the remaining hostages. The stakes had never been higher. The successful rescue at the first compound had sent shockwaves through the terrorist network. Sarah monitored radio communications as militant leaders issued shoot-on-sight orders for any suspicious foreigners. Roadblocks appeared overnight, and patrols tripled in frequency. The remaining 8 hostages were now scattered between 2 heavily fortified locations, each surrounded by paranoid guards expecting an attack. Sarah's extraction team had been forced to withdraw to a safer distance, leaving her completely alone in hostile territory. Her only allies were a handful of local civilians who risked their lives to help her. Among them was Emmanuel, a former teacher whose school had been destroyed by the same terrorists holding the hostages. His knowledge of hidden paths through the jungle would prove invaluable in the coming days. The second compound presented unique challenges. Intelligence reports indicated it was built inside an abandoned mining complex, with underground tunnels connecting multiple buildings. The hostages were believed to be held in the deepest section, accessible only through a maze of corridors that could easily become death traps. Sarah spent 3 days studying architectural plans from the defunct mining company, memorizing every tunnel and emergency exit. Her new cover identity was that of a relief worker delivering medical supplies to remote villages. This provided a legitimate reason to travel through the region while carrying equipment that could be useful for her real mission. She had dyed her hair black and altered her appearance with temporary tattoos common among local women. The transformation was so complete that even her backup team might not recognize her. The journey to the second compound took her through some of the most dangerous territory she had ever encountered. Government forces and rebel groups controlled different sections of the same roads, sometimes changing hands multiple times in a single day. Sarah had to navigate checkpoints manned by soldiers who might shoot first and ask questions later. At one checkpoint, a teenage soldier became suspicious of her medical supplies. He ordered her to open every container while his commanding officer watched with growing interest. Sarah's heart raced as she realized some of her equipment could be identified as military-grade. She maintained her cover story while mentally preparing for a fight that would likely end her mission before it truly began. The moment stretched endlessly until an explosion echoed from the nearby hills. The soldiers immediately forgot about Sarah as they scrambled to respond to what sounded like an artillery attack. She quickly repacked her supplies and continued down the road, knowing she had been minutes away from disaster. Emmanuel met her at a prearranged location deep in the jungle. His face was grim as he shared disturbing news. Government forces were planning a major offensive in the region, scheduled to begin in just 4 days. If the hostages weren't rescued before then, they would likely be killed in the crossfire or executed by their captors to prevent them from being liberated. The timeline had just become impossible. Sarah needed at least a week to properly survey the second compound and plan a safe extraction. Now she would have to improvise, relying on incomplete intelligence and hoping that years of training would compensate for inadequate preparation. They reached the mining complex at dawn. The facility sprawled across several acres, with rusted machinery creating a maze of hiding spots and potential ambush points. Sarah counted at least 30 guards patrolling the surface, all armed with automatic weapons and seemingly alert to any threat. Getting inside would require patience and perfect timing. She spent the entire day observing the compound from a concealed position. The guards followed predictable patterns, but their shifts overlapped in ways that left no obvious gaps in coverage. Sarah noted that food deliveries arrived twice daily through a heavily guarded main gate, while waste removal happened once each evening through a smaller rear entrance. As night fell, Sarah made her move. She had noticed that the waste removal truck left the compound with minimal inspection, suggesting the guards were less vigilant about what left the facility than what entered it. If she could access the truck during its evening pickup, she might be able to ride it out and then return through the waste disposal area. The plan required split-second timing. Sarah waited until the truck began its return journey, then sprinted across 50 yards of open ground to reach the vehicle. She grabbed onto the rear bumper and allowed herself to be dragged along the rough road for nearly a mile before the truck stopped at a disposal site outside the compound perimeter. From this position, she could approach the rear entrance under cover of darkness. The waste disposal area was poorly lit and smelled terrible, discouraging guards from spending time there. Sarah found a drainage pipe that led directly under the compound's rear wall. The pipe was barely wide enough for her small frame, and she had to army crawl through knee-deep water for over 100 yards. Inside the compound, Sarah found herself in the basement level of the mining complex. The tunnels were exactly as the architectural plans had shown, but years of abandonment had left them partially flooded and structurally unstable. Some passages were blocked by cave-ins, forcing her to find alternative routes through the maze. She moved carefully through the underground network, using night vision equipment to navigate while avoiding the main passages where guards might patrol. The hostages were supposedly held in the central section of the complex, but reaching them would require passing through multiple checkpoints. After 2 hours of careful movement, Sarah finally heard voices speaking English. Following the sound, she discovered a heavily reinforced door guarded by 2 militants. Through a crack in the door, she could see 4 hostages chained inside a small room. They appeared to be alive but showed clear signs of abuse and neglect. Sarah realized she faced an impossible choice. She could attempt to rescue these 4 hostages immediately, but doing so would almost certainly alert the entire compound and doom the remaining 4 hostages held elsewhere. Alternatively, she could continue searching for the others, but time was running out and her presence might be discovered at any moment. She decided to gather more intelligence before acting. Moving deeper into the complex, she found a second holding area where the final 4 hostages were kept under even heavier guard. The room was directly beneath the compound's command center, making any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. As Sarah studied the layout, she overheard a radio conversation that chilled her blood. The terrorist leaders had decided to execute all hostages the following morning as a message to Western governments. The timeline had just collapsed completely. She now had less than 6 hours to save 8 lives while surrounded by dozens of armed enemies in an underground maze. Sarah activated her emergency beacon, knowing that her backup team was too far away to provide immediate assistance. She was truly alone, facing odds that would challenge an entire special operations unit. But as she prepared for what might be her final mission, she thought about the promises she had made to the families of the hostages. Failure was not an option, regardless of the personal cost. The little girl Maria from the refugee camp flashed through her mind. All around the world, innocent people suffered while evil people held power. Sarah had chosen this life specifically to stand between the vulnerable and those who would harm them. Tonight, 8 innocent lives depended entirely on her skills, her courage, and her willingness to sacrifice everything for strangers she had never met before this mission began. Sarah had 4 hours until the executions were scheduled to begin. The underground complex buzzed with activity as guards prepared for the morning's grim task. She could hear commanders shouting orders and weapons being cleaned and loaded. The sound of her own heartbeat seemed deafeningly loud in the confined tunnels as she finalized her desperate plan. The rescue would require her to neutralize at least 12 guards simultaneously while freeing hostages from 2 separate locations connected by narrow tunnels. She had limited ammunition, no backup, and 1 small explosive device intended for emergency situations. Success would demand perfect execution and considerable luck. Sarah began by creating diversions throughout the complex. She triggered small fires in storage areas and damaged electrical systems to create confusion. Guards rushed to investigate these incidents, temporarily reducing security around the hostage areas. In the chaos, she managed to plant her explosive device near the compound's main generator. Moving to the first holding area, Sarah waited for the optimal moment to strike. When one guard stepped away to investigate a suspicious noise, she silently neutralized his partner and picked the lock on the reinforced door. The 4 hostages inside were weak but alert enough to follow her whispered instructions. Dr. Fletcher recognized her immediately despite her disguise. His eyes showed both relief and concern as he helped calm the others. Sarah explained they had minutes to reach safety before the entire complex erupted in violence. The hostages would have to trust her completely and move faster than their weakened condition might allow. Leading them through the tunnel system proved nightmarish. The hostages struggled to keep pace, weakened by weeks of captivity and poor nutrition. Sarah had to carry one man who had suffered a leg injury, while another woman collapsed twice from exhaustion. Every sound seemed amplified in the narrow passages, threatening to alert nearby guards. They reached a junction where Sarah faced another impossible decision. The tunnel split in 2 directions. One led toward the exit, while the other led to the remaining 4 hostages. She could escort this group to safety and return for the others, but time was running out. Alternatively, she could send them ahead alone while she attempted to rescue the final group, knowing they might become lost in the maze-like tunnels. Sarah made the hardest choice of her military career. She gave Dr. Fletcher detailed directions to the exit, along with her emergency radio. If she failed to return within 30 minutes, he was to call for extraction and leave without her. The weight of that decision pressed down on her as she watched the rescued hostages disappear into the darkness. The second holding area was more heavily guarded than before. Security had been increased after guards discovered the missing hostages from the first location. Sarah counted 6 armed men positioned around the entrance, with more patrolling the surrounding corridors. A direct assault would be suicide, but she had no other options left. She triggered her explosive device, plunging the entire complex into darkness as the generator exploded. Emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, but the initial confusion gave Sarah the opening she needed. Moving with deadly precision, she eliminated 3 guards before they could react to the sudden attack. The remaining guards opened fire wildly, their muzzle flashes creating a chaotic light show in the tunnel. Sarah used their panic against them, appearing and disappearing like a ghost as she systematically reduced their numbers. Her years of training took over as muscle memory guided her movements in the confined space. Breaking through to the final group of hostages, Sarah found them in worse condition than the others. 2 were barely conscious, and 1 showed signs of severe infection from untreated wounds. Getting them to safety would require carrying the weakest while supporting the others through miles of dangerous terrain. The escape became a nightmare of endurance and willpower. Sarah half-carried, half-dragged the weakest hostage while the others leaned on each other for support. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder as reinforcements arrived at the compound. Spotlights swept the jungle, and dogs barked in the distance. They had covered less than half the distance to the extraction point when Sarah realized they were being overtaken. The hostages simply couldn't move fast enough, and the pursuing forces knew the terrain better than she did. She made another command decision that went against every instinct she possessed. Finding a defensible position in a cluster of large rocks, Sarah ordered the hostages to hide while she prepared to hold off their pursuers. She had enough ammunition for perhaps 10 minutes of fighting, but it might be enough time for the hostages to reach safety. For the first time in her military career, she was preparing for a mission she didn't expect to survive. The first wave of pursuers appeared just as the sun began to rise. Sarah's position gave her a tactical advantage, but she was vastly outnumbered. She picked her targets carefully, making every shot count while the enemy tried to flank her position. The sound of gunfire echoed through the jungle as she bought precious time with her own life. Just when her ammunition ran dangerously low, the distinctive sound of military helicopters filled the air. Her emergency beacon had finally reached friendly forces, and a full extraction team was arriving with gunship support. The pursuing terrorists scattered as rockets, and machine gun fire decimated their ranks. Sarah emerged from her defensive position bloodied, but alive. Medics immediately began treating the rescued hostages while her commanding officer demanded a full report. She had successfully rescued all 12 hostages and gathered valuable intelligence about terrorist operations in the region. The mission was being hailed as one of the most successful solo operations in modern military history. But Sarah felt only exhaustion and a deep emptiness. She had pushed herself beyond every limit, sacrificed everything for the mission's success, and saved innocent lives. Yet as she sat in the military transport flying away from the jungle, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed inside her. The adrenaline that had sustained her for days finally wore off, leaving her face to face with the accumulated stress and trauma of years of dangerous operations. For the first time since joining the military, Sarah began to question whether she could continue this life indefinitely. The constant danger, the isolation, and the weight of responsibility were taking a toll that no amount of training could have prepared her for. As they flew toward the military base, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine what a normal life might look like. For someone who had been abandoned by her family and knew only military service, the concept seemed as foreign as the hostile territory they were leaving behind. She had become the perfect weapon, but somewhere in the process, she wondered if she had lost sight of what she was fighting to protect. The rescue mission was classified at the highest levels, meaning her heroism would never be publicly acknowledged. There would be no medals ceremony, no newspaper articles, and no way for her estranged family to learn about her sacrifice. Sarah Martinez, the woman who had saved 12 lives and prevented an international crisis, would remain as invisible to her family as she had always been. 6 months after the hostage rescue, Sarah received orders that would change her life forever. The mission's success had earned her a promotion and assignment to an elite counterterrorism unit based in Washington, D.C. For the first time in over a decade, she would be stationed in the United States, just 3 hours from her hometown, where her family still lived in their mansion, pretending she had never existed. The transition to domestic operations proved more challenging than any foreign deployment. Sarah found herself struggling with civilian life in ways that surprised her. Simple activities like grocery shopping or eating in restaurants felt overwhelming after years of constant vigilance. She jumped at unexpected sounds and automatically scanned every room for exit routes and potential threats. Her new assignment involved coordinating intelligence between various agencies to prevent domestic terrorist attacks. The work was important but felt strangely hollow after years of direct action. Sarah spent her days analyzing data and attending briefings in sterile government buildings, a far cry from the jungles and mountains where she had found her purpose. During her 3rd month in Washington, Sarah encountered someone from her past in the most unexpected way. She was leaving a coffee shop near the Pentagon when she literally collided with her younger brother Michael. He had been rushing to catch a taxi, distracted by his phone, when they crashed into each other on the sidewalk. The recognition was instant and mutual. Michael dropped his briefcase, scattering legal documents across the pavement while Sarah stood frozen, unsure how to react. 12 years of separation stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Her brother looked exactly as she remembered, but older, wearing an expensive suit that marked his success in their father's business empire. Michael spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. He said her name like a question, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Sarah helped him gather his scattered papers, noting his hands were shaking slightly. She had imagined this moment countless times over the years, but the reality was more awkward and painful than any of her fantasies. They found themselves sitting in the coffee shop, 2 strangers who had once been inseparable. Michael explained that he was in Washington for business, negotiating a major real estate deal for their father's company. He spoke carefully, avoiding direct mention of their parents or the circumstances of Sarah's estrangement from the family. Sarah learned that her siblings had both married and started families. Michael had 2 young children he clearly adored, based on the photos he showed her with obvious pride. Her sister Elena had become a federal prosecutor and was expecting her first child. The family gatherings Sarah had been excluded from continued without any acknowledgement of her absence. The conversation eventually turned to Sarah's life, though she could only share limited details due to the classified nature of her work. She mentioned serving in the Navy and being stationed overseas, but nothing about her real experiences or achievements. Michael listened with growing amazement as he began to understand the magnitude of what she had chosen over their family's wealth and expectations. As they talked, Sarah noticed something she hadn't expected to see in her brother's eyes: admiration. Michael had followed their father's predetermined path, achieving success and financial security, but he seemed genuinely impressed by Sarah's independence and courage. He admitted that he sometimes wondered what his life might have been like if he had made different choices. Their reunion was interrupted when Michael's phone rang. Their father was calling about the business deal, and Sarah could hear her father's voice through the phone. The sound hit her like a physical blow, bringing back memories of the last time they had spoken. Her father's words of disappointment and rejection echoed in her mind as if they had been spoken yesterday instead of 12 years ago. Michael ended the call quickly, but the moment had shattered their fragile reconnection. The weight of their family's disapproval hung between them, making further conversation feel impossible. Sarah stood to leave, but Michael grabbed her arm gently, pleading with her to wait. He told her something that stopped her in her tracks. Their parents had never spoken about her, but he and Elena had never stopped thinking about their missing sister. They had followed news reports about military operations, wondering if Sarah was involved in the conflicts they read about. Michael had even hired a private investigator years earlier, trying to locate her, but military records were too well protected. The revelation that her siblings had searched for her stirred emotions Sarah had buried for years. She had convinced herself that her family was better off without her, that they had moved on completely. Learning that Michael and Elena had mourned her absence gave her hope she hadn't dared to feel. Michael begged her to meet with Elena, who was in town for a legal conference. Sarah's sister had become everything their parents wanted: successful, respectable, and firmly within the family circle. But, according to Michael, Elena had never forgiven their parents for cutting off all contact with Sarah. The three siblings had never discussed it openly, but the wound had never healed. That evening, Sarah found herself in an upscale restaurant, waiting for a sister she hadn't seen since Elena was a teenager. When Elena walked in, heavily pregnant and glowing with health, Sarah barely recognized the confident woman her baby sister had become. Elena's reaction was immediate and emotional. Tears streaming down her face, she embraced Sarah fiercely, apologizing over and over for their parents' cruelty. Elena's perspective on their family dynamics was eye-opening. She revealed that their parents' marriage had become increasingly strained after Sarah's departure. Their father had thrown himself into business with manic intensity, while their mother had become socially withdrawn and bitter. The perfect family image they had tried to maintain was cracking under the pressure of their own guilt and stubbornness. More shocking was Elena's revelation that their father had been following Sarah's military career from a distance. Through his political connections, he had learned about her assignments and achievements, though he had never shared this information with the rest of the family. Elena suspected he was proud of Sarah, but too proud himself to admit his mistakes. The conversation continued for hours, with Elena sharing details about family events and changes that Sarah had missed. But she also spoke about the emptiness that Sarah's absence had created. Family celebrations felt incomplete, and there was an unspoken understanding that they were all pretending everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. As the evening ended, Elena made an unexpected request. She asked Sarah to attend her baby shower the following month. Their parents would be there, along with extended family who hadn't seen Sarah since she was 18. Elena believed it was time for the family to confront their dysfunction and find a way to heal. Sarah's initial response was immediate refusal. The thought of facing her parents after all these years terrified her more than any combat mission she had ever undertaken. But Elena persisted, arguing that Sarah had proven her strength and worth beyond any doubt. It was time for their parents to confront the consequences of their rigid expectations and cruel rejection. That night, Sarah lay awake in her apartment, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with the biggest decision of her personal life. She had faced down terrorists, saved innocent lives, and served her country with distinction. But the prospect of walking into a room full of family members who had written her off filled her with dread. Yet something had changed during her conversations with Michael and Elena. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she wasn't alone in the world. Her siblings had never stopped loving her, and their reunion had awakened feelings she thought were dead forever. Perhaps it was time to stop running from her past and, finally, confront the family that had abandoned her only to discover that a Navy SEAL never truly dies.